Aloha and welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm David Austin, and today we have with us a very special guest. It is Dr. Chip Fletcher. He is a professor in the Department of Geology and Geophysics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he's also an associate dean for academic affairs at the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Fletcher recently won an award at the Environmental Protection Agency's 12th Annual Environmental Awards Ceremony for climate change science, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And the award is given to science that identifies opportunities for greenhouse gas and air quality co-benefits, provides policy-relevant information on local impacts of climate change, adaptation strategies, and science that informs near-term policy. So can you tell us a little bit about the research that led to this award?
Sure. Well, the award language, in my case, was actually for assisting in the creation of the Island Center for Climate Adaptation, which has the acronym ICAP.
Okay.
ICAP is at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. It is a center of excellence under the University of Hawaii Sea Grant program, and its director, Maxine Burkett, is a law faculty at the School of Law. The purpose of ICAP is to recognize the special needs of island communities in the Pacific and around the world. In fact, Maxine is from Jamaica, and to assist in the process of identifying adaptation strategies to climate change and management tools to help with the problems of climate change in island communities. I was also given the award for my efforts in public outreach, writing climate science in a way that's attainable from the layperson's point of view, as well as for the research that I've been doing for years in coastal erosion problems.
Terrific. And I take it that Hawaii has, does it have more of its share of coastal erosion problems than the mainland? That's kind of a loaded question.
No, I won't say any more than anywhere else. Some estimates indicate that 75 to 80% of the coastlines of the world are eroding. And in Hawaii, we find on the order of 70 to 80%, depending on which island you're on, of sandy beaches are experiencing chronic erosion. Wow. There are local areas where the shoreline is actually gaining sand or accreting, but generally speaking, erosion is the trend.
Okay. What are some of the unique aspects of island ecologies that you feel are important to make the public aware of?
Well, climate change is threatening lots of island communities and natural ecosystems. One of the great concerns associated with climate change is a reduction in rainfall.
Okay.
Hawaii has seen a reduction in rainfall. It's been documented and measured. This has led to a reduction in base flow into streams. Now, base flow is groundwater that flows into a stream and keeps it flowing in between storm events or in between rain events. And because we can correlate stream gauge records to rainfall records, the researchers have been able to document that it's decreasing groundwater flow into streams that has led to their decline. In fact, this work was done by the U.S. Geological Survey, Pacific Water Resources Center, which is right here in Honolulu. Okay. Decrease in rainfall obviously raises concerns for fresh water, drinking water, for irrigation, for instance, as well as to ecosystems that are living in our streams. Another issue related to climate change is sea level rise.
Okay.
Sea level rise not only threatens to increase erosion, but it's likely to raise the groundwater table in the coastal zone. So the majority of our communities live down on the flat land around the coastal zone. The water table is not far below the ground, and we know that the water table rises and falls with the tides. We've measured that, so we know it's intimately connected to the ocean, and as the ocean rises, the water table rises until there'll be places where it's actually cropping out on the land surface, causing permanent wetlands. This is not just conjecture. We see this in the industrial area by the airport, Mapunapuna.
You already see this?
Yeah, we already see it. That area is largely fill and artificial fill, and the fill has compacted, so it's a particularly low-lying region. And we get the ocean coming up through the storm drain system, the manhole covers on the side of the road at high tide, especially during the full moon. And at times, it can be mid-calf depth. Then if you add rainfall to that, the rain comes streaming down our watersheds, which are largely paved, and so the rain doesn't soak into the ground. You can get water depths in Mapuna Puna during a rainstorm that are up to your waist.
Wow.
And so it shuts down businesses, it makes it impossible to travel on the roads. And as sea level rises going forward this century, we're likely to see this problem increase in frequency and severity.
This is clearly not a problem for our grandchildren to be worried about. This is something that we should be addressing.
That's right. We should be addressing it right now. And, although the decision-making with regard to mitigating climate change is a political issue and belongs in the political arena, there's unfortunately been a poor job of reporting the truth or the science about climate change in certain sectors of the media. Climate change is real. It is happening. And in fact, the National Academy of Sciences has recently issued a report. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read a section of this. This is called Advancing the Science of Climate Change. It's a publication by the National Academy's Press, the National Academy of Sciences. And it says, some scientific conclusions or theories have been so thoroughly examined and tested and supported by so many independent observations and results that their likelihood of subsequently being found to be wrong is vanishingly small. Such conclusions and theories are then regarded as settled facts. This is the case for the conclusions that the Earth system is warming and that much of this warming is very likely due to human activities. Now, if the wiggle wording, very likely due to human activities, bothers you, well, a proper scientist would say the sun is very likely to rise tomorrow.
Right.
So that's perfectly normal language for us saying we have every confidence in this statement.
I recently learned of some alarming percentage of Americans, though, that do not believe this.
That's why I bring it up, because as long as we have a significant fraction of our population that doesn't believe this, and as long as they have political representation in Washington, we're going to continue to stonewall on the real action that needs to be taken for this issue. And the real action is to cut our carbon emissions, turn to renewable energy, and this is just a good idea anyway. I mean, we need to wean ourselves off of petroleum because of the health problems, the air pollution problems, and our reliance on an important resource that's not under our control. It's controlled by largely the Middle East or various countries in South America. So for national security and defense, as well as the environmental reasons, switching to renewable energy makes a lot of sense.
How do you help, as an educator, help explain to skeptics the science behind this? And the reason I bring this up is I was recently listening to an NPR piece, and Ira Glass, who is the host of This American Life, had a scientist such as yourself and a young woman, and the young woman did not believe in climate change science. And the scientist, I think she might have been a geologist or an oceanographer, was explaining to her that this is fact and explained all of the scientific data that clearly shows that this is happening. How do you tackle skeptics like that? Is there a way of just even if you show them all, it seems like even if you show them all of the data and read them things like this, they still don't believe it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, if a person doesn't have an open mind, if they're not truly seeking the truth, you can talk till you're blue in the face and you really won't make any impact on them. Secondly, there are lots of sources of information documenting that surveys among scientists show that there's 98 to 99% agreement on the basics of climate change, that Earth's atmosphere is warming and that human activities are the cause. It's not difficult to prove the case if someone is willing to educate themselves.
Right.
Another issue is that some people just don't think scientifically. This is sort of training your thinking that has to happen in our education system, and that is fine-tuned and promoted in our college system. There are a number of people out there that just haven't learned how to think critically, think scientifically about issues. Also, depending on your politics, there are national outlets where your politics feel comfortable and the message you're getting is that climate change is not real.
And what would the agenda be for arguing that it isn't real?
Well, there are lots of sort of standard skeptical arguments. And in fact, there's a wonderful website called skepticalscience.org.
Okay.
And it sounds like it's a climate skeptic website, but it's actually got over 100 arguments that climate skeptics use. And there's a little essay devoted to each argument, and it references the peer-reviewed scientific literature and refutes, offers the elevator speech, the short refutation of the skeptic argument. A very common skeptic argument is that today's warming is nothing more than part of a natural cycle.
Right. I've heard
And
this.
so an awful lot of very good research has gone into documenting paleoclimatology, the climatology of the recent past. And our instrumentation, our believable observations really only go back to the very end of the 1800s. And prior to that, we have to use geologic proxies.
Okay.
We have to use sediments and ice cores and other types of natural materials from which we infer and hypothesize what they mean in terms of past climate. One particularly thorny issue is known as the medieval climate or climate anomaly, or the medieval warm period.
Oh,
And
right, yeah.
this has taken a lot of traction with the skeptics, that there was a time during the medieval history on the order of 1,000 to 1,500 years ago where climate was warmer. Well, it turns out the climate was warmer, but only in Western Europe and the North Atlantic. And because throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, most climate science was being done in Europe and North America and focused on the North American, the North Atlantic climate proxies, this medieval warm period kept showing up in tree rings and other sorts of climate proxies. But the search for the medieval warm period throughout the rest of the planet found that it didn't exist. And when you look at a truly global record of temperature change, the medieval warm period really doesn't show up. And today's climate, today's warming is at least a degree warmer than any warming around the medieval period. So there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that this is part of a natural climate cycle. And the medieval warm period is only one argument that's put up there. So is the sun doing this? Well, if the sun were doing this, the entire atmosphere would be heating.
Right.
Right? Well, it's not. It's only the troposphere. In fact, it's the lower troposphere, which is the portion of the atmosphere against Earth's surface.
Okay.
So if we're trapping heat in the lower portion of the atmosphere, one would conclude that the upper atmosphere must actually be cooling. And in fact, that's the case. Satellites see Earth as cooling. We look like we're cooling to a space observer, and that's because we're trapping heat down near Earth's surface. So I could go on and on.
Right.
Lots of these arguments, they're easily refuted, and there's peer-reviewed, documented literature that proves them.
If we let climate change take the course that it's taking now and continue burning fossil fuels, and I hate to sound so depressing about this, but what will Hawaii look like in 100 years or 500 years?
Well, that's actually the course that we're taking now. We have decided, the United States has decided, and because we are a leader, other countries are saying, well, why do we have to sacrifice for climate change if the United States isn't sacrificing? They're all the guys driving the SUVs around in the first place.
Right.
So what will it look like throughout as we go forward through the 21st century? We're going to see sea level rise. And in Hawaii, this is going to cause the sort of coastal erosion and coastal flooding issues that I described earlier. We're going to see the ocean acidify. This is going to make it increasingly difficult for corals, many types of plankton, finfish, and any sort of ocean critter that secretes a calcium carbonate shell. And that's what a seashell is. It's made of calcium carbonate, and a lot of the plankton make calcium carbonate. And there are probable negative effects to the entire oceanic food chain that are going to result from this. Other issues that we are concerned with are decreases in rainfall in Hawaii. If we decrease rainfall, there are going to be a series of roll-off effects from that. It raises some worries about our food sovereignty.
Right.
We are dependent on other people sending us food. We're dependent on the food that is shipped in here, and our money in turn goes outside our economy, our local economy, and the degree to which we can raise our own food, eat our own food that's raised here in the islands is going to increase our safety and security. Well, with decreased rainfall, it's going to be harder to produce local food.
Right.
And here's a bit of an irony. We're seeing a decrease in rainfall, but when it does rain, there's an increase in intensity.
Right.
So the most intense rains are becoming more intense.
Mm-hmm.
And this has a series of sort of a domino effect. Intense rains lead to flash flooding.
Right.
They lead to increased sediment erosion and muddy, polluted runoff into our coastal waters. Mm-hmm. It leads to slope instability, mudslides, rock falls, other things like that. I drive over to Kailua every day. When I come out of the polytunnels, there's often a little bit of rock that's falling down
Mm-hmm.
Onto the highway there during periods of heavy rain. So those are the major issues.
And certainly, I mean, from a purely economic standpoint, the most valuable real estate here in Hawaii is right along the coast.
Right, absolutely.
And that's going to be gone.
Well, the initial reaction to accelerated coastal erosion is going to be to build seawalls.
Okay.
And it's a beach management practice. It's really a beach destruction practice that Hawaii and many other places in the world have been exercising for a long time. As we build more seawalls, the beach in front of them is going to disappear. This is going to decrease coastal access. It destroys the dune system and the beach ecosystem, which are very important ecosystems for the nearby reef and shallow water. And so another aspect of this is that as sea level rises, large waves will overtop into our properties, and they cause damage as well.
Of course. And how much is the sea level expected to rise over the next 100 years?
Well, the global average sea level rise in the 20th century was on the order of 6 inches per century, or
Okay.
about 1.5 to 2 millimeters per year, really 1.5 millimeters per year. It is now rising about twice that, on the order of a foot per century, and it's about 3 millimeters per year. But that's a global average, and there's actually a lot of variability to sea level change around the world today. Sea level and the ocean surface is mapped every 10 days by satellite mission, and this database is now getting on to be 18 years long. It's a really wonderful database that all of humanity can be proud of. 18 years of mapping the ocean surface like this. And one of the things we've learned from this database is that sea level in the Western Pacific, in Micronesia and areas where there are lots of island communities, especially atoll communities, sea level there is rising on the order of 3 feet per century, actually a little bit more than that. There's some places where it's 4 feet per century. Now, why is that happening? Recent research suggests that sea level in the Western Pacific is rising because the trade winds have accelerated. And an acceleration in trade winds, blowing literally the water of the surface water of the Pacific towards the west, has actually might be responsible for a decrease in sea level against the west coast of North America.
Huh.
And when you look at the satellite map of the rate of sea level rise, you see lots of rise over to the West Pacific and actually minor sea level fall in the East Pacific. Here in Hawaii, as with so many other natural processes, Hawaii sort of sits in the sweet spot. Our sea level rise in Honolulu has been a constant trend of about 1.5 millimeters per year for a century, as measured by one of the longest tide gauges in existence. How long will we continue to escape the global average of 3 millimeters per year or more? That question is unknown. Getting to the original point of your question, though, how high is sea level likely to rise by the end of the century? Estimates today range. A best case scenario is on the order of 0.8 meters, or about 2 3/4 feet to 3 feet by the end of the century. A worst case scenario is up to 1.9 or 2 meters. So we're getting up to 6 to 6.5 feet of sea level rise.
Wow.
Which is enormous
Yeah.
and devastating. Which scenario is likely to happen? Most of the sea level researchers would put their money on the low end of the
Okay.
spectrum, but that's assuming that Greenland and Antarctica don't do something sudden and catastrophic in terms
Right.
of melting.
Right.
And so they're being watched very closely also.
So really, it seems like we need to approach the problem from both a prevention of like additional global warming from happening and also adaptation, because it's my understanding that a lot of these forces have already been put into motion and we can't really stop them now.
That's right, that's right. Carbon dioxide, the molecule, can have a very long lifetime in the atmosphere. And so there's heating in the pipeline, so to speak, that will take many centuries to play out. So you're absolutely right. There are really sort of two directions where we need to spend energy. One is mitigation, which is to literally decrease the amount of carbon dioxide, decrease the amount of carbon that's produced, and increase the amount of the storage of carbon dioxide. And this leads to carbon sequestration, which is where you literally pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and you store it someplace, such as in the crust.
What sort of technology is available for that? You can actually do that?
Yeah, you can. There are artificial trees that have been engineered. They would line freeways. They are big, white, filter-looking things, and they would be sucking up all the carbon dioxide produced by our automobile traffic. One scheme is to grow crops, use those as the source of energy by burning crops. You take them to a power plant, you burn the crops to produce electricity, and then you capture in the plant the carbon dioxide produced by those crops and the methane, and you pump it into the crust or down into the deep sea. Therefore, and then you can regrow the crops, and so you're sort of constantly pulling carbon dioxide out of the air, using it to produce energy, and then storing it someplace where it's not going to participate in the greenhouse effect.
It seems a lot more complex than simply burning fewer fossil fuels.
Well, really what most of us would like to see is burn fewer fossil fuels.
Right.
And things like a carbon tax, a barrel tax, these are very smart measures. And President Obama mentioned in his recent State of the Union address that maybe it's time we stop supplementing the oil industry with tax dollars.
Right.
You know, last time, as he said, last time I looked, the oil companies were doing pretty well. Do they continue to need our help? End those tax supplements and take that money and either give it back to the taxpayer or plow it into promoting renewable technology development.
And it seems like here in Hawaii, we really are promoting quite a bit, more so possibly than any other state that comes to mind. Maybe not, maybe not in the entire United States, but it seems like we really are pushing renewable energy here in Hawaii.
Yeah, one certainly gets the impression that a lot is happening in Hawaii, and this is not an area where I'm a particular source of information, but just as as a resident of Hawaii, as a father of a family here, I feel good about the amount of innovative energy development discussion that's going on.
Can you explain to me a little bit about what you address in your Living on the Shores of Hawaii book?
Yes, Living on the Shores of Hawaii, just published through UH Press. I've got chapters that are on all of the major topics that are relevant to our shorelines. There are natural hazards that are described in separate chapters, such as volcanism, earthquakes and tsunamis, hurricanes. And then I go into a series of chapters relating to climate, water resources, stream flooding and mass wasting or slope failure, sewage treatment and polluted runoff, climate change and sea level rise, beach erosion, reefs and overfishing, and then sort of a summary chapter where I try and pull out some of the major issues and highlight them. So the goal here is it's written for the layperson who's curious about some of these scientific issues that are important to how we manage and live on our shorelines.
Excellent. And was this a collaborative effort, or was it something that you edited or wrote most of?
No, I wrote the whole thing. I've
Okay.
got several co-authors, which were, there was a law student that helped me with editing. There was an environmental writer who helped sort of smooth out and edit some of my writing. They all helped make the book what I think is a very readable product, but it's all my penmanship.
Excellent, excellent. What do you think is the most if you could select one chapter or one subject area, what do you think is the most vital for the public to know?
Climate change and sea level rise is a chapter that I think is very relevant for Hawaii. And I actually, in it, discuss a lot of the issues we've been talking about here, the decrease in rainfall, the issues of climate change that are very relevant to our Pacific Island community and specifically to Hawaii. That's a chapter that I would actually like to pull out of the book and bind separately and give out as sort of a just general literature piece. And having thought of that, I actually did go forward and write a general literature piece called Hawaii's Changing Climate. It's a briefing sheet, and this is published by the University of Hawaii Sea Grant College and the ICAP, the Island Center for Climate Adaptation. In it, I go through all of the published, peer-reviewed observations of changing climate here in Hawaii, the decrease in rainfall, the increase in temperature, the rising sea level, ocean acidification. And it is a briefing sheet. It's only about 4 to 6 pages long, and the idea was for everybody to be able to read this, from our legislators all the way down to give it to your grandmother and have her read
It is very understandable. If I can understand it, then you can understand it. It's very, very helpful, and it really is a terrific, seems to be a real soup to nuts summary of what's going on.
And it's available online. The Sea Grant College, their publications pull-down menu, you can find it online and order a copy for free.
For those who don't know, what is the Sea Grant College?
Sea Grant College is part of a national entity funded by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, which is in the U.S. Department of Commerce. Every state that is on a coastline, including the Great Lakes states, their primary public university has a Sea Grant office.
Okay.
And the idea is to bring together researchers and teachers on the faculty to work in extending their information to real applied problems in the region. And so there is what's known as the extension faculty. And UH Grant has an extension faculty with expertise in aquaculture, forestry, reefs and the reef fishery, coastal erosion, climate change. So these are people that are at the university, and very often they are seated out on the different islands or working with different government agencies to provide advice and expertise in a very non-opinionated way. Their role is to say, here's what science can tell you, here's what we know that is scientific, not to advocate for anything, but to simply provide information. Every state in the U.S. that has a coastline has a Sea Grant College like this.
Huh. Great.
It's called a college. The idea is like we have the College of Arts and Sciences or the
Right.
School of Ocean Science and Earth Science and Technology. Well, we have the Sea Grant College. It's embedded within UH Manoa.
Okay. And are you active on the? That's basically what one of the major kind of like outlets for your research, right?
Right. They offer grants every 2 years, and so faculty apply for these grants, and if you're selected, then they foster your research. They will pay for a graduate student, and you are then on the one of the Sea Grant researchers or Sea Grant faculty as long as your grants are going with them. And they take that information that's the result of your research, the extension faculty then spread it out in an applied way to help problem solve in the local community.
Okay. What sort of traditional practices or native Hawaiian practices have you encountered or feel might be relevant to your research? Because I know that a lot of the uniqueness of Hawaii is what probably drives some of your research. I don't know if you've encountered that or if you have anything to say about it.
Well, fundamentally, I'd say their approach to the land, and by land I mean the ocean, the air, and everything that lives there. The native Hawaiian approach is that we are the servants, and the land is the master. The typical Western approach is that we are the masters, and the land is there to serve us.
Right.
Well, if you take the attitude that we are there to serve the land, then it's our role to protect the land, to conserve the land. It's not a matter of hiding the land so that it is completely untouched in sort of the environmental protectionist point of view,
Right.
unless that is a key aspect of maintaining an entire ecosystem or watershed. No, the idea is the land will offer water, it will offer food, it will offer living accommodations for us, provided that we serve it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that any culture that is attempting to survive in sort of a indigenous manner back in the day, you really would have to have that attitude about the land in order to get all that it has to offer. Many Hawaiians today still grow taro in their backyards, even though they might live in Hawaii Kai and be your next door neighbors, but they're doing that as a cultural practice.
Right.
So I think simply that attitude towards the land is something that could play a powerful role in our recognizing how to adapt to climate change. Another aspect is to maybe consider how we rebuild or how we build in the coastal zone. And this is not necessarily a Native Hawaiian thing, but the slab-on-grade poured cement, large multi-million-dollar stone mansion. By stone, I mean cinder block.
Right.
This is really not necessarily an appropriate way to build on a coastal zone that's subject to tsunamis and hurricanes, and while it may stand through some of these, may survive some of these hazards, coastal erosion will ultimately get you.
Right.
And if you respond to coastal erosion by building a seawall, sort of extending the whole stone footprint idea, well, then you destroy the beach and you have serious impacts on the nearshore water quality with that seawall. So I think sort of going back to the way Hawaii originally developed its shorelines. And if you look on certain beaches, especially along portions of Kailua Beach, you can still see the houses that were built 40, 50, 60 years ago. They have a huge setback from the ocean. They're sort of small footprint, cottage-style houses. This was the right way to go back then. You are more flexible with the environment and not nearly as destructive. So sort of not only Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian, but also sort of traditional Hawaiian, traditional Western Hawaiian, if you will, approaches to land development make sense these days.
How does a seawall, because they're so popular in Hawaii, how does it actually promote erosion?
Well, typically you put up a seawall because the shoreline is eroding.
Okay.
In a shoreline that is chronically eroding, it is migrating landward.
Okay.
Much of our coastal plain is made of sand.
Right.
I mean, when I live in Kailua, when I dig in my backyard, there's sand there. So erosion would normally free that sand, and we'd still have a beach, even though the beach is migrating landward.
I see.
We'd have to get my house out of the way and my garden and everything, but ultimately we would continue to have a beach as long as the beach were allowed to continue migrating landward. Put in a seawall, and the consequences are obvious. The
Right.
beach is going to narrow and eventually disappear in front of that seawall.
Right.
That vertical face of that seawall will cause wave reflection so that you start to scour the seafloor in front of it. You remove all the soft substrate that many of the critters like, the infauna and epifauna that like to burrow into the ground. All that sand goes away and you end up with sort of a barren limestone desert in front of the seawall. Some seawalls at low tide have a little slope of sand there, and people point to it and say, look, my beach isn't destroyed. But if your beach is underwater at high tide, I would say you don't have a beach.
Right. Right.
So that's how seawalls destroy beaches. And then there are follow-on effects. You can no longer traverse along the shoreline where the beach has disappeared. And many of our homes have in-ground sewage disposal, septic tanks or cesspools. In fact, Hawaii has the most of these per capita of any state in the nation, especially along the coastal zone. So when your sewage goes into your backyard and it's meant to be cleaned there through the sand, guaranteed a lot of it will find its way out to the seawall through cracks in the seawall or seep out into the ocean underneath there. And you tend to get excess nutrients along coastal zones where there are seawalls and in-ground sewage disposal.
The thought of having, one cesspool in the water in front of your house is not also a very appealing thought,
No,
you know?
it's not. But, a neighborhood that's been built like that, really very few people can afford to put in a mainline sewage disposal system that will
Sure.
take your sewage to a wastewater treatment plant. A sign that you have nutrients leaking into the shoreline. One potential sign is growth of fleshy algae.
Okay.
And a shoreline that has a lot of fleshy algae, certainly one potential cause of that is sewage systems, in-ground sewage systems.
I also noticed in the Hawaii's Changing Climate Report, you talk a little bit about cloud zone and evapotranspiration.
Right.
What is that?
Well, this basically has to do with water, right? So our water cycle is relatively easy to understand. We have trade winds that approach from the east or the northeast. They travel across hundreds to thousands of miles of open ocean surface. They evaporate a lot of water. They are moist, and as soon as they hit the high volcanic islands of Hawaii, they're forced to go up in elevation. And as they rise, the air gets cooler, and the rate of evaporation in this air starts to decrease, and the rate of condensation starts to increase.
Okay.
And so just like the outside of a glass of water with ice in it, you bead up water on the outside. Well, that's a cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And so condensation up above 2,000 feet on our mountain ranges forms these clouds. These clouds rain, and this is the primary source of our water. We get a little bit of water from Kona storms and other storm systems that come in from other directions, but most of that rainfall tends to run off quickly.
Okay.
It's cloud water that is our primary source of water. Well, as global warming heats the air, there's some concern that the base of this cloud may rise. And there's a question, could it rise to the point where it simply skips over the tops of our mountains? In which case our warm trade winds would not be condensing as they roll over the tops of the mountains, and we would make a shallower cloud layer. The top of the cloud is also a concern. This is the inversion layer.
Okay.
If you've ever been up to Mauna Kea or Mauna Loa, or just flying into Hawaii, you're looking down on the tops of our clouds. How will global warming treat the tops of the clouds? Will it stay the same place, in which case a rising cloud base is going to shallow the clouds?
Okay.
Will it rise or will it decrease, actually? And so our cloud depth is an important aspect of this. And evapotranspiration is the process where plants and trees, transpiration is the process where plants and trees take up water and then release it back into the atmosphere. And if we decrease our cloud layer, change our cloud layer, our rainforests may suffer negative impacts. And one consequence of this is that we may see, in fact we're seeing it already, we may see mosquitoes able to migrate up into rainforests where the environment wasn't appropriate for them before. And hence we see a rise in avian malaria, in our bird population because of the rise of mosquitoes.
I wasn't even aware that there was malaria.
Yep, avian malaria.
Avian malaria,
right,
okay.
yeah. But having been in American Samoa last week at a climate conference, I was speaking with a public health expert from Fiji, and he told me the very disturbing news that we're seeing an increase in dengue fever, which is a mosquito-borne disease, malaria, Nile fever, and some other diseases are sort of traveling with a migrating mosquito population. And he said there's even evidence that mosquitoes are becoming more aggressive and that their sort of biting pattern is increasing in aggression.
That is disturbing.
It's very disturbing, yeah. This is a good example of some of the sort of unexpected surprises that are in the climate playground, if you will.
Right.
Like no one had really predicted that the trade winds would accelerate and that the Western
Right.
Pacific would be, buried in rapid sea level rise so early this century. Some of these aspects of climate change are where the real front of climate science is located right now.
Uh-huh.
The climate scientists are not engaged in the debate of is climate changing, are humans the cause?
Right.
They've moved way beyond that, and they're engaged in the debate of what will climate change look like locally?
Right.
And what are the processes that are driving climate change on a local scale?
What are some of the more what are some examples of that? What are some like what is right now on the cutting edge of climate change science?
Well, I think the most important thing is to take our computer models. These are called global circulation models.
Okay.
Ideally, you would have a model that had all the physics and chemistry of air circulation in the atmosphere, water circulation in the ocean, mixing between the air and the ocean, landscape effects such as heat transfer and evaporation and evapotranspiration from our plants, human impacts, environmental processes, and all this would be woven together into some sort of magical computer model
Right.
that would accurately predict what we have seen in the past and what we're seeing today, and therefore, if we start to perturb a certain part of it, like let's increase the CO2 content to 500 parts per million, and today it's only at 390 parts per million, let your model run, and you'll be able to say, look, you're going to see a 25% decrease in rainfall over the Hawaiian Islands. You're going to
Right.
see a sea level rise of 0.85 meters by the end of the century, but only in the Western Pacific or something like this. That's the cutting edge of science, building models that can see like that. But we're a long way from that magical model I just described.
Right.
So instead what we do is we use our models and downscale them. Maybe they aren't integrated with the ocean. Maybe they don't take into effect all of the necessary processes, and they give us a simplified version. And so building sort of local scale, downscaled models, climate models, to give us a better understanding of how climate is going to change locally, I see as one of the major forefronts of science. And a little plug here, the International Climate Research Center, Pacific Research Center, IPRC, at the University of Hawaii, is one of only a handful of climate modeling research institutes in the world, and they are at the forefront of trying to resolve how climate change will affect Pacific Islands and areas in the Asian Pacific and the West Pacific.
And that's their geographic area of focus right now.
That's what they're
is,
mostly interested in right now, yeah. So we recently had a little climate symposium at the university, and we had climate modelers come out, and we had various folks there, and it turned out that a lot of climate expertise was predicting a decrease in the trade winds. And yet when you look at observations, which are not as easy to get your hands on as you might think, we're seeing an increase in the trade winds. So this what might appear as a rather simple issue
Right. really
is turning out to be a surprise to us.
And I think that is one thing that is just concerning, just in the sense that there are a lot of surprises, and there are things that you almost can't possibly model for,
Right.
you know, and you don't know if it's going to be bad or catastrophic, you know, and it's
Right.
somewhere in that range, and that I think is what should at least be worrying politicians quite a bit.
Yes, err on the side of safety, and that's what
Right.
all good planning is. You plan for the worst case scenario and hope for
Absolutely.
the best case scenario. By the way, I want to say that the increase in the trade winds is not necessarily happening in this part of the Pacific. It seems to be mostly located to the west of us. So
Okay.
it's not as if Hawaii is necessarily seeing an increase in the trade winds, but as you go to the west of us into Micronesia, there is this sort of prolonged La Nina type of climate that's taking place. And La Nina, just very simply, is a period where you see accelerated trade winds.
La Nina is the opposite of El Nino.
El Nino, yeah, and at least here in Hawaii, you tend to see reduced trade winds.
Okay.
And as a result, we tend to go through drought,
Okay.
short-term drought. El Ninos tend to last for several months to half a year, but La Nina can stretch on for several years.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's interesting. I was going to ask you more about the symposium you recently were the keynote speaker at in American Samoa. If you want to just give some details about what
Sure.
you set out to accomplish and what happened, that would be great.
Right. This is the Climate Change Summit put on by the governor of American Samoa. It was a 2-day summit. The first morning was characterized by speeches by the governor and by myself. The afternoon, we had other resource people that spoke on various aspects of climate change and adapting to climate change, not only in American Samoa, but in Micronesia and other parts of Polynesia. The second day, though, was especially fascinating. It was completely given over to a citizens forum. And there were over 200 people that attended, and they were asked to attend one of 4 breakout sessions. So there was a breakout session on coastal water quality and our reefs.
Okay.
There was a breakout session on public health issues of climate change, a breakout session on freshwater and the agroforestry, and a breakout session on infrastructure and our communities. And each one of these had over 50 people attending. American Samoa has an interesting political structure. There's the classic Western government, and then there's the sort of cultural government structure of matais and chieftains, and there are even mayors. And so putting all these people in one room where there's a lot of protocol involved in who's allowed to speak and who really isn't allowed to speak was interesting. We were told, for instance, that it would be best if we got all the women aside and allowed them to speak only in the absence of men, and the men all to the side and in the absence of women, and children likewise. Anyway, the purpose was for these breakout sessions to produce a set of recommendations, and over the period at the end of the conference to weave these together into a report that would go to the governor. He opened the conference by saying, I want your recommendations, and I promise they won't sit on the shelf. I will go to the legislature with these, and whatever I can, whatever seems to have legs, we will see that it can be done.
How applicable do you think this model would be to Hawaii? Do you think this would fly? Aside from the fact that women and men couldn't speak at the same time, do you think that the concept would work?
I do, but I think we all recognize that democracy is an incredibly messy process.
Right.
But, if you just keep your eye on the fact that messy but beautiful, I could easily see a conference of this type at the convention center. In fact, there have been conferences of this type at the convention center where people were brought together to discuss aspects of managing our environment. In fact, Hawaii has the Ocean Resource Management Plan, ORMP. This is the result of a public citizens-based conference at the Convention Center several years ago. Several sectors were defined, and it's this plan that provides the framework for all agencies at county, state, and federal level in Hawaii to come sit around the same table and talk about where there are issues in the coastal zone and related environments overlap with each other.
Okay.
One would think that there would be great integration among permitting agencies at different jurisdictions, county, state, and federal, but in fact this is the only regular one that it meets with high frequency, and that's once a month. There are subgroups that meet at higher frequency, and it didn't come into existence until, well, there were earlier predecessors, and so the predecessors have been around for 20 years or more, but they used to meet twice a year or 4 times a year, and now they're meeting every month. The ORMP working groups recognize climate change in Hawaii. They're producing documents. They're making plans with regard to climate change. But nothing official has yet been adopted in terms of policy in Hawaii.
Okay.
So maybe it is time we had more vigorous effort to find some policies for Hawaii.
Absolutely. What sort of scientists were involved in this summit in Samoa? Were they international scientists or mostly from the Pacific, or?
Well, there was Don Hess from the College of the Marshall Islands, from Majuro. He not only teaches climate science in Majuro, he's also a person, he sits on the Marshall Islands Environmental Advisory Council. And this is a very large council that represents all levels of the community there. And they will recognize a particular issue, such as the freshwater lens up in Laura, which is a sort of an island at the end of the atoll. They'll go to that local community, they'll talk about potential problems, and they'll do a community-based process where planning at the community level, which we refer to as community-based climate risk management, is promoted by this advisory council. And so he told us about that process and how successful it is. There was also, let's see, an individual from SPREP, South Pacific Resource and Environment. I'm sorry, I don't know what the acronym fully stands for, but they're located in Apia in Western Samoa, I believe. There were folks from Fiji. Our public health expert came from Fiji. So yeah, it was a very Pacific, which is appropriate, panel of resource people.
Terrific.
Yeah.
If you could tell the citizens of Hawaii one thing
Put me on the spot.
about climate change, if there was one thing that either you felt they should know or one thing you felt that they should do, what would it be?
Go beyond the headlines, and if you can, drill into some scientific information, and make an attempt to learn something about global warming. Talk to a scientist. I don't know if your next door neighbor is a scientist or not, but if you know of a scientist, talk to them. Not all scientists by any means have focused on this issue, and so they may not be completely up to date on the latest with regard to climate change. But I guess the one thing I would say is that it's real, and there are documented, published results of global warming in Hawaii that have many of us very worried. If the trend of decreased rainfall, if the trend of increasing temperature, if the trend of rising sea level, if any of these accelerate or even continue, they're going to have very severe negative impacts on our livelihoods and our quality of life.
And our home.
And our homes, absolutely.
And if you could tell Governor Abercrombie anything, what would it be? What would you have him address?
Well, I think he already, I mean, not that I know him, but
Sure,
from
course,
what I might infer about him, I think he probably already understands the severity of climate change. I'm sure that now, at this moment, early in his administration, he's dancing as fast as he can with just thousands of issues.
Sure.
And I fully expect and anticipate that he'll make some step towards building climate change policy here in Hawaii. Yes, we are moving strongly towards renewable energy, but that's not enough.
Sure.
That's necessary, but not enough. And I hope that he will convene some sort of advisory group at least to provide him with recommendations that could be taken to the legislature, and that we could begin to see some policies to lead us towards adapting to the problems of climate change here.
Okay, so it's not just of course the push towards renewable energy. It's again the adaptation aspect that we were talking about to prepare us for when the effects of climate change render our island kind of unworkable or unusable or.
I wouldn't use such severe language. I think that we can adaptation. The goal of adaptation is to make the island workable in the context of changing climate.
Okay.
To figure out how we can manage water better, manage our coastal zone better, manage our ecosystems better. And this actually brings up an important issue. One of the ways to approach climate adaptation is to take no regrets steps. For instance, there are already intersections which tend to flood. There are already stretches of coastline which tend to have waves overtop them when there's large swell. There are already regions where we've been in drought.
Okay.
Right? So it doesn't matter whether or not you believe in global warming. Let's take a step towards improve either adaptation or mitigation with these particular issues.
I see. Yeah.
They make sense anyway. And I don't know whether Governor Lingle believed in global warming or not, but she saw that getting us off of petroleum and into renewable energy would be a no-regret step.
Absolutely. There were plenty of other reasons, absent the existence of global warming,
Right.
that led her to the conclusion that it's a good idea.
It's a good idea, yeah.
And where's your research going now? What do you think are your next steps?
I'm interested in giving planners some idea of how sea level will change in the future on a sort of a fine scale, time scale. Not just where will sea level be by the end of the century, but where will sea level be in a decade, 2 and 3 and 4 decades. And to do this in a very local fashion. So we have a methodology using tide gauges. We've done a study in American Samoa using the Pongo Pongo tide gauge.
Okay.
We use that tide gauge and its history of sea level variability to predict for the planners there what they might expect for sea level rise and the impacts of sea level rise going forward in the next several decades.
Okay.
And we build scenarios. We do a best-case scenario and a worst-case scenario. We're doing that for the Honolulu tide gauge, for the South Shore of Oahu, through a University of Hawaii Sea Grant program called the Coastal Storms Program. In fact, there's a consortia of faculty at the university that are working on what will the impacts of continued sea level rise from Diamond Head to Pearl Harbor be. We have Carl Kim from the Department of Urban and Regional Planning looking at census data and infrastructure data. We have Phi Chung from the Department of Ocean Resource Engineering, who's going to be using his hurricane storm surge model. And we're going to put all these together. My role is to look at some of the detailed elevation data, put all these together and get a better handle for the planners to use on what areas are vulnerable to sea level rise and what areas are not.
That's terrific. That's terrific. I think that'll be absolutely vital for the development of the state. So, well, great. Thank you so much for coming by. I really appreciate it. We hope to have you on again.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.